The data came back from the lab, and it did not make sense. Dr. Pontus Skoglund was running genetic analysis on ancient remains from the Amazon basin in 2015 when his algorithm flagged something that the established timeline of human migration into the Americas had no explanation for. Embedded in the DNA of people who had lived in South America thousands of years ago were markers associated with populations from the opposite side of the planet, Aboriginal Australians and other Australasian groups, separated from the Americas by the width of the Pacific Ocean. The conventional model of how humans arrived in the Americas was, at that point, considered essentially settled. Around 15,000 years ago, people crossed from Siberia into the Americas via a land bridge that existed during the last ice age. One source population, one migration route, one clean origin story. The model was repeated in every textbook, displayed in every museum, cited in every documentary. There was no room in it for a Pacific signal. Skoglund checked his data 3 times. The signal held. And when researchers began examining what the ancient DNA of Mesoamerica specifically was recording, the picture that emerged was not just surprising. It was, as one researcher put it, a crime scene. A crime committed across millennia, written in the biology of the people who survived it, and invisible to conventional archaeology until the genetic tools existed to read it. Here is what that data actually says, and why it changes the way you have to think about the civilizations that built some of the ancient world's most extraordinary structures. What the Y chromosome records that history books don't. To understand what the ancient DNA of Mesoamerica revealed, you need a brief primer on what different types of genetic material can tell you. Mitochondrial DNA is inherited exclusively through the maternal line. You received yours from your mother, who received hers from her mother, and that chain extends back through time without interruption. Y chromosome DNA works in the opposite direction. It passes exclusively from father to son, generation after generation, carrying the male lineage forward. When you analyze ancient remains and find mitochondrial DNA that shows continuity across centuries while Y chromosome data shows a sudden, complete break, you are looking at a specific kind of event. The women survived and carried their genetic heritage forward. The men did not. Dr. Maria Avila Arcos at Mexico's National Autonomous University spent months analyzing Y chromosome data from ancient Mesoamerican remains. What she found, repeated across multiple sites and multiple civilizations, was not gradual change or partial replacement. The male lineages of the Olmec, the builders of Teotihuacan, the early Maya, and the Toltec had not diminished over time. They had stopped. Completely. The genetic chains that should have passed from father to son across hundreds of generations had been cut. The breaks were not gradual. They coincided exactly with documented moments of civilizational collapse. When a city fell, when a culture collapsed, the female genetic signatures continued into the next cultural period. The male signatures did not. Women were absorbed into whatever came next. Men were not. Dr. André Moreno Estrada at Mexico's National Laboratory of Genomics described the data as watching a crime committed in genetic slow motion. Across multiple civilizations, across multiple collapses, the same pattern repeated. Every collapse. Every time. This is the question the data raises before we even get to the Aztecs specifically. Who was doing this, across thousands of years and multiple distinct civilizations, with such consistent results? Leave your answer in the comments, because the range of possible explanations is genuinely wide, and the most obvious one is not necessarily the only one. Teotihuacan, the city where gods were made and men were erased. No site in Mesoamerica makes the genetic findings more vivid than Teotihuacan. At its peak, around 400 AD, this city housed more than 125,000 people. It was one of the largest urban centers on the planet at the time, comparable in scale to Rome. Its influence extended across all of Mesoamerica, with trade goods bearing its symbols found hundreds of kilometers in every direction. The Avenue of the Dead, flanked by the Pyramid of the Sun and the Pyramid of the Moon, was one of the great architectural achievements of the ancient world. The Aztecs, arriving centuries after its fall, believed it had been built by gods. They named it the place where men became gods. They made pilgrimages to its ruins and incorporated it into their own cosmological understanding of the universe. It was, in their view, where the current age of humanity had been created. They called the era of the current sun, the fifth sun, and they understood Teotihuacan as the location where the gods had assembled to create it. Around 550 AD, Teotihuacan fell. What happened exactly remains disputed. Internal revolt, external invasion, and environmental stress have all been proposed. What the physical evidence shows is destruction with a fury that suggests personal hatred rather than strategic military action, temples burned, monuments deliberately defaced, sacred spaces systematically destroyed. What the genetic evidence shows is more specific and more disturbing. Within a single generation of the collapse, the Y chromosome profile of the surviving population had shifted completely. Different men were moving through those same streets. The male lineages of the people who had built those pyramids, who had maintained that city across centuries, who had filled those markets and conducted those astronomical observations, gone. Not diminished. Replaced, completely, within the time it takes for a new generation to be born. The female mitochondrial DNA shows continuity across the collapse. Women survived. Their daughters carried their mother's genetic heritage forward into the next cultural period. But the men who fathered those daughters were not the men who had built the city. What does it do to your understanding of these ruins when you know that the people who built them were genetically erased, and that the people who came after them were something different entirely? Take a moment with that before we get to who came next. The genetic landscape the Aztecs walked into. The Mexica, the people who would become known as the Aztecs, were not present for any of these collapses. According to their own historical accounts, they spent generations wandering before finding a home, guided by their patron deity Huitzilopochtli toward a specific sign, an eagle perched on a cactus with a snake in its beak. They found that sign on an island in Lake Texcoco in 1325 and founded Tenochtitlan there. The timing of their arrival, and the genetic condition of the region they arrived into, is one of the more striking correlations in the data. By 1325, the male lineages of the major preceding civilizations had been repeatedly disrupted. The Olmec, Teotihuacan, the early Maya, the Toltec, each had experienced the same pattern of civilizational collapse followed by complete replacement of male genetic signatures. The region was, in genetic terms, a landscape of broken male lineages, surviving female lineages, and populations whose paternal ancestry had been reconstructed from external sources multiple times over. The Aztecs arrived with their own male lineages intact. They had not been subjected to the cycles of collapse and replacement that had shattered the genetic heritage of the populations already living in the region. Their Y chromosomes were coherent, undiluted, the product of their own population history rather than successive waves of conquest and absorption. Dr. Alexander Ioannidis at Stanford analyzed the genetic shifts that followed Aztec conquest of surrounding city-states. The Y chromosome changes were dramatic and rapid, sometimes occurring within a single generation. The pattern of what happened in each conquered region followed a consistent sequence. Local male genetic signatures diminish, Aztec Y chromosome markers become dominant, and the maternal lineages of the conquered region continue while their paternal lineages are replaced. This was not metaphorical conquest. It was genetic conquest, playing out in the biology of every generation that followed. Here is a question worth sitting with. When we talk about the legacy of a civilization, we usually mean its architecture, its art, its language, its ideas. But what the Aztec case reveals is that conquest also has a biological legacy that persists long after the political structures have collapsed. How does that change your understanding of what it means for a civilization to survive? Nahuatl and the Genetic Highway. When Spanish conquistadors arrived in 1519, one of the things that surprised them was how widely understood Nahuatl, the Aztec language, was across Mesoamerica. It was spoken by traders in markets far beyond the reach of Aztec military power. Messengers used it across regional boundaries. It had become a lingua franca for an enormous geographic area. This linguistic spread was not separate from the genetic spread. It was evidence of the same process. Language travels with people. Trade routes carry not only goods but people, and people carry genetic material. Aztec merchants, administrators, priests, soldiers, and settlers moved along the same networks that carried Nahuatl vocabulary, and they carried their Y chromosomes with them. The genetic data from regions connected by Nahuatl trade networks shows patterns of mixing consistent with sustained long-distance movement and intermarriage. The Aztec expansion was operating on multiple levels simultaneously: military conquest in some regions, cultural and commercial penetration in others, and running through all of it, the persistent biological reality that wherever Aztec men settled, their genetic material became part of the next generation. Tenochtitlan itself, at its peak before the Spanish arrival, was larger than any city in Europe at the time. The Spanish soldier Bernal Díaz del Castillo, writing about first seeing the city rise from the lake, described his fellow soldiers asking each other whether they were dreaming. The scale of what the Aztecs had built in approximately 2 centuries from nothing was genuinely without parallel in the region's recent history. They built it on a genetic landscape that had been repeatedly cleared of competing male lineages. Whether that landscape was prepared by forces they set in motion, or whether they were simply the most recent wave in a cycle that had been repeating for thousands of years, is a question the data does not fully answer. But it is worth asking. The Australasian signal and the deeper pattern. The Australasian DNA signal that Skoglund's lab identified in Amazonian remains is not connected to the Aztecs. It is far older. It predates the Olmec, predates Teotihuacan, predates any named Mesoamerican civilization. It represents contact or migration that would have occurred at the very earliest period of human presence in the Americas, possibly more than 15,000 years ago. What it demonstrates is that the pattern of population replacement and genetic disruption in the Americas did not begin with the Aztecs or with any of the civilizations they followed. It was present from the earliest recoverable period of human occupation in the region. The Australasian genetic signal is concentrated in the Amazon basin and nearly absent elsewhere, which tells researchers that the population carrying it was once more widespread and was subsequently replaced, absorbed, or pushed into the geographic margins where their descendants eventually persisted. The cycle of replacement, in other words, is not a feature of late Mesoamerican history. It is a feature of the entire human presence in the Americas from the beginning. Graham Hancock argued for decades, against significant institutional resistance, that the conventional narrative of the ancient Americas was incomplete, that catastrophic events and violent processes had erased civilizations and peoples from the historical record, and that the evidence for this erasure was being overlooked or dismissed by mainstream archaeology. He was treated with consistent hostility by the academic establishment, his work characterized as pseudoscience and his conclusions as irresponsible speculation. The ancient DNA research did not vindicate every claim Hancock has made. Some of his specific theories remain outside what the evidence supports. But the core contention, that the Americas experienced repeated violent population replacement at a scale the conventional narrative had not recognized, and that entire peoples were erased from the historical record, has been confirmed by genetic data that was not available when he was first making those arguments. Whether that vindication changes your assessment of him or not, the data itself is not in dispute. The Y chromosomes are gone. The pattern of erasure is documented. The question is what to do with that knowledge. What the Spanish interrupted and what survived. The Aztec expansion was 2 centuries old when the Spanish arrived in 1519. In historical terms, it was still in its early stages. The speed at which it had spread, both militarily and genetically, suggests that left uninterrupted it would have continued rewriting the genetic landscape of Mesoamerica for generations more. The Spanish arrival stopped that process. European diseases, for which indigenous populations had no immune preparation, killed an estimated 90% of the population of Mesoamerica within a century. European military technology dismantled the political and military structures of the Aztec Empire. European colonization imposed new cultural, religious, and social structures over what remained. But the genetics proved more durable than the political structures. Modern population genetics of Mexico and Central America show the Aztec Y chromosome signatures as persistently dominant in regions that came under Aztec control before 1519. 2 centuries of expansion produced a biological legacy that survived 5 centuries of colonization, disease, cultural suppression, and the deliberate destruction of Aztec records, temples, and institutions. The Spanish burned the books, destroyed the sacred sites, banned the religious practices, and dismantled the political infrastructure. The DNA remained, because there is no mechanism for erasing it. The people living in those regions today carry the biological legacy of the Aztec genetic conquest alongside the legacy of the earlier civilizations whose maternal lineages persisted through every collapse. Their ancestry is a layered record of every wave of replacement and every surviving female lineage, a biological archive of events that the written record was never permitted to describe. This is what ancient DNA analysis has made possible, reading a history that was never written down, that survived no official record, that was erased from political memory and cultural continuity, but that persisted in biology beyond the reach of any conqueror. The genetic material in the remains of people who died thousands of years ago is a more honest witness to what actually happened than any document that was written, preserved, or selectively destroyed by the people who came after. The question that the Mesoamerican genetic data leaves open, and it is a genuine one without a comfortable answer, is how many other places on Earth contain the same kind of hidden record, male lineages cut off at moments of civilizational collapse. Female lineages continuing through every disruption, the real history of violence and replacement preserved in biology long after the political history was rewritten by whoever survived. Archaeologists are now running this kind of analysis across every region where ancient DNA can be recovered. What they are finding, consistently, is that the textbook version of the ancient world was significantly more violent and significantly more discontinuous than anyone had previously been willing to admit. What does it change for you, knowing that the ancient structures we regard as the achievements of specific civilizations were often built by people whose male descendants were completely erased before those civilizations even fell? Share your perspective in the comments. This kind of data raises questions about identity, about legacy, about what it means for a civilization to persist, and those questions do not have simple answers. The conversation between different perspectives is where the interesting thinking happens.